It started with an empty campsite deep in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains. A coffee pot, still warm on the fire ring. 2 blankets laid out side by side. No footprints leaving the area. No sign of struggle. No tent. Just the stakes, still standing in perfect formation. On September 10th, 1981, Ranger Daniel Reed came across what would become one of the most haunting disappearances in the American wilderness. The vanishing of Hannah Cole and Ethan Price. The couple had planned a simple 5-day trip into Silver Ridge National Forest. They were young, experienced, careful. The kind of campers who packed spare batteries and weather charts. But when they failed to return home, their Jeep was found untouched, keys inside, and breakfast half made. At first, authorities believed they had wandered off trail. But the closer investigators looked, the stranger it got. Their supplies were still there, their shoes, their maps, their medicine, everything left behind. The only thing missing was the tent itself. Within hours, search teams spread through 7 miles of rugged terrain. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers. No trace. The forest seemed to swallow them whole. And when the first snow hit, the search froze, along with the last hope of finding them alive. But 15 years later, new technology and one mother's determination would uncover evidence buried in the earth, and a truth no one saw coming. Stay with us as we follow the evidence, the theories, and the decades-long fight for answers. If you believe every mystery deserves a voice, like, subscribe, and share this story to help keep their memory alive. In the next chapter, we return to Silver Ridge, where investigators found the first clue that changed everything. It begins on September 10, 1981, inside Silver Ridge National Forest, Montana. A routine patrol turns into a report. Ranger Daniel Reed hikes a quiet loop off the Bitterroot Range and steps into an abandoned campsite that looks like someone paused time and walked away. A coffee pot still warm on the ring. 2 blankets laid out on the ground cloth. Folding chairs open. Nothing scattered, nothing broken. Nothing that suggests panic or a fight. In a place where the terrain punishes carelessness, the scene reads as careful, then suddenly interrupted. 2 names are tied to the site. Hannah Cole, 22, a meticulous environmental science student who tracks weather and water like homework, and Ethan Price, 24, a freelance photographer who plans shots more than he chases them. They checked in for a 5-day permit from September 6th to September 10th, scheduled to drive out that morning and call home to confirm they were safe. That call never came. Their Jeep Wagoneer sits in the lot with the doors locked, gear inside, and nothing that hints at a road trip or a hasty exit. Reed walks the perimeter and finds the details that always matter in the backcountry. The lay of the ground, the proximity to water, the recent weather. Bitterroot country is unforgiving, steep walls, narrow gullies, and creeks that change tone after a single night of rain. He radios in a possible missing campers situation and holds the area. It didn't feel trashed or spooked, he later says. It felt paused. Hannah and Ethan were not casual visitors. Hannah kept a small notebook for field notes, barometric shifts, stream noise, wind direction, and quick sketches of plant life. Ethan carried a 35mm camera and traveled light, but he never skipped the basics: maps, first aid kit, extra matches, water treatment. Their plan was a conservative loop: base near Silver Ridge Creek, day hikes branching out, return each afternoon to the same spot. The checklist in their car matches that plan. Food for 5 days, fuel, a spare flashlight, the permit stub tucked in the glove box. No sign. The first oddity is the tent. The stakes are still in the ground in a neat rectangle, guy lines still tied and tensioned to rocks and nearby saplings. But the tent fabric itself is gone. Not packed, not cut, just missing. The footprint is clear on the ground cloth, dust where the floor had been. Yet the shell is nowhere in the immediate radius. That makes no sense to anyone who camps. If you're breaking down, you pull stakes and coil lines. If you're running, you don't take the tent and leave the stakes behind. Inside the cooking area, breakfast waits in mid-motion. Grounds in the pot, tin cups out, a small pan with residue from a quick heat-up. The trash is orderly. There's no evidence of wildlife tearing through food. A bear bag rope is coiled on a branch above the site, not in use. Nearby on the boulder that works as a low table, someone set 2 maps. One, laminated topo of Silver Ridge, the other a smaller paper map with pencil marks along North Trail and Creek Bend. Both maps are dry. Both maps are still there. The gear list that remains suggests no plan to leave the area for long. Medicines sealed and labeled, including a small blister kit. A repair sleeve for an aluminum tent pole. A spare pair of socks clipped to a line to air out. Most striking, Hannah's hiking shoes placed neatly near the entry of where the tent should be. She owned 1 pair for the trip. There's no second pair in the car, no camp clogs in the kit. If she walked away from camp, she did it barefoot or in socks, which makes no sense in Bitterroot country. Pine duff hides sharp rock and broken twig everywhere. The call to the sheriff's office goes out just after noon. Sheriff Raymond Burke arrives later that day, a man with 2 decades of mountain calls behind him. He's seen bad weather, busted ankles, wrong turns, and tragedies that show their teeth right away. This scene is different. "It's too clean," he notes to his deputy. Like the moment right before someone sits back down. There are no drag marks, no heavy scuffing, no blood, no sign of a struggle within the ring of camp or along the obvious exits from it. Family context lands fast. When Hannah's mother doesn't get the promised phone call, she contacts the station. By afternoon, her worry has a file number. Friends confirmed the couple stuck to prep lists and weather checks. A clerk at the ranger station remembers them asking about creek crossings and where to avoid after rain. They didn't sound reckless. They sounded prepared. Investigators do the first pass the old-fashioned way, widen the circle and read the ground. The immediate trails show boot traffic, but not fresh enough and not directional enough to pin to the couple. The soil near the creek is damp, but not torn up. There's no new slide scar close to the site, no obvious sink. On the fire ring, soot is recent. On the table, a film of fine dust has not yet settled over the metal mugs, which means someone used them not long before Ranger Reed arrived. Sheriff Burke orders minimal interference with the scene as they document. This isn't yet a rescue or a recovery. It's a question. Did 2 people step away for a quick look at the water and lose the path? Did they make a short move to higher ground and fail to mark their return? Or did something change, the water level, the terrain, the sound in the dark, that forced a fast, unplanned move? There is one piece of context that sits heavy on anyone who works the mountains: how sound travels. At night, streams can sound closer or farther depending on wind and temperature. Campers new to a specific canyon can misjudge distance. But Hannah had notes about this. She tracked details others ignore. If they misjudged anything, it wasn't for lack of attention. A colleague of Reed's, interviewed later, puts it plainly. You can tell panic when you see it. Gear gets dumped. Food gets ripped. This place didn't have that story. The car backs that up. The Jeep shows no tampering, no broken glass, no sign anyone used it as shelter in a storm. The spare keys hang inside a small pouch where they were supposed to be. A flashlight inside still works on first click. What keeps repeating in everyone's head is the tent. A missing tent with stakes left behind isn't a prank and isn't ordinary theft. The path out of the site has low branches. Dragging a pitched tent would snag immediately. If someone packed it, they did it with time, care, and intention. If it left the site another way, it left under force strong enough to pull fabric free without disturbing lines that were set to hold against wind. As the light shifts and temperature drops, the site takes on the quiet of places that keep secrets. The sheriff draws a soft perimeter, not a circus of tape and floodlights, because it isn't that kind of scene. He logs the time and the initial inventory, and he assigns a deputy to sit the site until morning. The instruction is simple. Nothing in, nothing out. By the book, the next hours would normally bring quick leads, footprints heading out, a neighbor camp hearing voices, a hunter spotting a signal fire. None of that arrives. What they have instead is order, a routine that stopped mid-breakfast, a car that waited to be loaded, a pair of shoes that should be on a trail not sitting tidy in a place where a door once unzipped. The case narrative for this opening period writes itself in clear lines. Two responsible adults check into a high-risk but well-marked area with an achievable plan. They set a stable base near a creek and keep their space organized. Sometime after breakfast prep, their presence vanishes from the campsite, with no sign of a fight, no sign of wildlife intrusion, and no sign of a long walk out. The object that should have anchored the site, the tent, has been removed from the picture in a way that contradicts both normal packing and normal chaos. In mountain work, investigators lean on three questions because they're the only ones that matter early. What changed? How quickly did it change? Who knew about it? Here, the first is the only one with any hint of an answer. The terrain and the water are the variables that move. Bitterroot weather shifts without warning, streams wake up, narrow cuts can funnel wind and water in minutes. If something changed, it likely started off-site and reached them before they could finish coffee. A final layer of context belongs here for anyone hearing this story for the first time. Silver Ridge isn't a place that erases people without leaving a trace. Searchers usually get broken branches, a discarded bandana, a trail of poor choices. What they get now is silence, firm ground, and a neat rectangle of stakes around an absence. As evening settles on September 10th, the questions harden into the only frame that fits. Where did they go? Why is the tent gone while its anchors remain? And what happened between a warm coffee pot and a quiet clearing that could make two prepared campers disappear without marking the dirt? Sheriff Burke writes a line in his notes that others will echo for years. It feels like they vanished into the air. The stage is set by the facts visible at the site. No speculation. The investigation begins at the edge of an empty campsite and moves straight to the locked Jeep Wagoneer sitting in the lot. The vehicle is clean, undisturbed, and still smells like canvas and fuel. Inside the rear compartment, officers log an organized stack of gear. A blue pack with Ethan Price's initials stitched on the shoulder strap. A compact first aid kit, a roll of duct tape, extra batteries, a water filter, and a coil of thin rope. In the side pocket of the backpack, they find a 35mm camera wrapped in a bandana and 2 rolls of undeveloped film. Nothing about the car reads fear or flight. It reads plan and routine. On the front seat, beneath a folded windbreaker, lies a laminated topographic map of Silver Ridge and a paper day-hike map with faint pencil marks. North Trail is traced with a light hand. Creek Bend is circled twice and underlined once. A ranger who helps inventory the car says later, "People mark views and overlooks. They don't usually underline the spots where the creeks split." Whoever marked this was watching the water. There is a small notebook in the jacket pocket. It belongs to Hannah Cole. The handwriting is tidy and clipped, the kind you use when you're cold and writing on your knee. The last entry is dated September 8th, 2 nights before Ranger Daniel Reed steps into their camp. It reads, "The water sounded closer last night. Maybe the creeks changed its path." It isn't dramatic, it's observational, the way scientists record small shifts they don't want to lose. But in the context of a missing tent and a half-made breakfast, the line lands hard. If the creek really did move closer, the campsite's safety could have changed without warning. Back at the fire ring, investigators walk the ground in slow, careful arcs. They see no sign of a fight, no ripped fabric, no paw prints or claw marks around the cooking area. Food is not torn open, only opened. A pan shows a thin film of residue. A coffee pot is mottled with heat stains and still smells like grounds. The trash is consolidated in a small bag, tied off and set aside. Bears do not respect tidy camps. They ruin them. This one is inside the footprint of the tent, near where the door would have unzipped, sit Hannah's hiking shoes. They are placed toe out, the way people set shoes before crawling into a sleeping bag. There is no second pair in the car, no camp shoes, no boots rolled under a seat. The detail matters. This forest floor hides harsh surprises under soft needles. Sharp rock, glassy twigs, sudden edges. No one who knows this terrain leaves camp to explore without footwear. The shoes being here suggests she hadn't planned to walk anywhere. That fact resists every simple story. Sheriff Raymond Burke arrives in the late afternoon and walks the scene with his deputy and Ranger Reed. Burke's been through enough lost hiker calls to know what they look like in the first hour. Panic leaves a trail. Accidents leave scars on the ground. This site shows neither. He writes a clean, short line in his field notes that will move, almost word for word, into the official report. No footprints leaving the site. No drag marks. No panic. It's like they just vanished between breakfast and the next breath. The sheriff orders the area held with a light perimeter. No floodlights, no crowd. Just time and documentation. He checks the weather ledger at the ranger station. Night temperatures on September 8th and 9th dropped close to freezing. The mornings were clear. If Hannah and Ethan had stepped away voluntarily in the dark without proper layers, they would have felt that drop within minutes. The idea that they simply wandered off for a long walk with nothing on their feet and no coat does not survive basic scrutiny. They pulled call logs and radio records. There were no distress calls from this basin. No SOS bursts on the ranger net. No civilian reports of flares or smoke columns. The nearest campers on record are several miles away and reported nothing but wind in the tops of trees. In the 2 days before discovery, no one saw lights moving on the ridges after dark. That silence matters, because the forest is not shy about repeating human noise. Sound carries in clean, cold air. A searcher says later, if someone had been yelling for help within a mile or two, somebody would have heard a piece of it. The ground within 100 yards gives the same answer every time: undisturbed. The trails in and out show the normal traffic of late summer, but nothing that can be tied to fresh exit tracks from this campsite. The creek edge near camp is damp but not churned. There's no fresh slide scar within sight, no obvious break where bank collapsed. The only persuasive variable remains Hannah's note about the sound of water. This is where the map marks begin to matter. North Trail and Creek Bend are not scenic names on a postcard. They are functional labels where channels split and rejoin, where a shift of a foot or two can put water against soil it hasn't touched in months. People who spend time here learn to pay attention to tone. A low rush is normal. A higher roar can mean rain somewhere upstream and a change in volume at your feet. If the creek moved closer in the night, the safe distance they measured when they pitched that tent could have shrunk without a single raindrop falling on their camp. Even so, the tent remains the loudest fact. If a sudden change in water forced them to react, why is the shelter missing while its bones remain? Investigators test simple explanations and discard them. Theft by passerby? Unlikely. There's easier gear to steal in plain view, and no car tracks or boot trails suggest an intruder. A gust strong enough to rip fabric off poles while leaving lines tied and stakes in place. Winds like that leave a footprint of damage around a site and break small hardware. Everything here is still orderly. Family and friends help fill in the couple's normal habits. Temperatures, timelines, and objects converge. Breakfast never finished. The coffee pot, still warm when Reed arrived, suggests a short window between activity and absence. The mugs on the table don't have a new film of dust. Ash in the ring is recent. In normal cases, investigators use small timestamps like these to narrow the search radius and prioritize likely corridors. Here, they sharpen the puzzle. The window is short, the radius should be tight, and yet nothing points outward. Before dark, Burke calls the initial phase. The scene is documented and held. A deputy stays overnight on a rotation. The instruction is simple and absolute. Preserve every small thing. At the end of the day's log, the sheriff adds a line that sits heavy on the page. I've seen accidents, storms, and panic. This isn't any of them. This is something else entirely. It isn't poetry. It's the absence of category. The point where experience doesn't help. By the time the sun slips behind the Bitterroot ridge, the investigation's first chapter is set in clear steps. A locked car with gear and maps that fit a 5-day plan. A tidy kitchen line paused mid-morning. A tent footprint holding stakes and lines without the tent. A pair of shoes that should be on a path resting instead where a door once unzipped. A single journal line noting a change in water. And around all of it, quiet ground. The emotional load for the people in uniform is not grief. It's pressure. A scene that gives you nothing still demands an answer. They are trained to push outward with structure. Start where the facts are strongest. Move in measured circles. And test the terrain that can change fastest. The water and the night rise to the top of that list. If something forced 2 careful campers to break routine, it likely began at the creek and moved in. Plans are drafted for daybreak. Assign 1 team to the North Trail corridor and 1 to Creek Bend, both within a 7-mile radius of camp. Expand slowly, keep line of sight, mark every deviation, and flag any sign of fabric, cord or a... Night settles over Silver Ridge. The car sits where it sat in the morning. The shoes sit where they were placed. The map with underlines waits on the front seat. The field notebook with the single sentence about water returns to an evidence bag. The scene holds steady, and the people around it accept that the next hours will not give answers. They will give structure. In the morning, the search will expand in 3 directions. For now, the only honest conclusion is the one the paper already carries. Nothing here points to panic, crime, or a voluntary walkout. The facts point to change, sudden, close, and powerful enough to erase footsteps before anyone knew to look. The search began at first light on September 11th, 1981. What had started as a missing person report was now a coordinated operation deep inside Silver Ridge National Forest. 18 people gathered at the ranger station, local deputies, forest rangers, and volunteers from nearby towns who knew the terrain better than anyone. They were briefed quickly, divided into 3 units, and sent in separate directions. The first team took North Trail, a steep path that climbed along the northern ridge. The second headed toward Creek Bend, the section marked twice on Ethan's map. The same place investigators believed the couple may have camped too close to. The third group moved along Devil's Spine, a thin ridge of rock and pine trees that cut through the middle of the forest. Dangerous, but high enough to provide a clear vantage point. Each group carried radios, compasses, and topographic maps, but the communication lines were spotty. The mountains swallowed signals, and the echo of voices bounced off the cliffs, making direction hard to trust. The teams were instructed to stay within eyesight whenever possible, and to log every sound, footprint, or object that looked out of place. By noon, the first day had already tested them. The North Trail unit reported seeing faint prints near a runoff stream, but the ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and the edges had collapsed. They couldn't confirm whether the marks belonged to a man, a woman, or even to hikers from a previous week. Near Creek Bend, one ranger thought he heard a voice. 2 short... Burke ordered an extended grid search around Creek Bend for the following morning. "That's where the story keeps pointing," he told his team. "If that creek shifted, we'll find something along its edge." The men and women nodded, but fatigue was already setting in. The terrain was unforgiving, dense pine forests on steep slopes with sudden drop-offs and fast, hidden streams that could twist an ankle in seconds. Even moving a mile in that landscape could take an hour. That same morning, a new presence arrived at the base camp. Linda Cole, Hannah's mother. She had flown in from Seattle overnight after hearing from authorities that her daughter was missing. Her arrival changed the tone of the operation. She moved with a sense of command, asking questions faster than anyone could answer. She demanded to know how far they'd searched, whether they had used dogs, and if aerial scans were possible. When told that the county's budget didn't allow for helicopters or specialized canine units, she refused to accept it. "Then we find another way," she said. "I'll pay for it myself if I have to." Her persistence impressed some and frustrated others. Sheriff Burke, already exhausted from coordinating the crews, tried to explain the limits. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "this terrain can't be cleared in a few days. It takes time." Linda didn't back down. "Then we'll search until we find her," she replied. "I don't care how long it takes." By the third day, the teams had covered nearly 7 square miles of ground. They used colored ribbons to mark completed sections of forest, but the ribbons kept tearing loose in the wind and disappearing. No clothing, no gear, no sleeping bags. Every trail seemed to lead back to the same silence. On September 13th, a light storm rolled in from the west. Clouds dropped quickly, covering the upper ridges in mist. Helicopter support, finally approved through a state emergency fund, managed less than 3 hours in the air before wind shear forced the pilot to return. From above, the forest looked endless, an ocean of dark green, unbroken and unforgiving. On the ground, searchers pressed on through cold drizzle that turned the soil slick. They scanned drainage ditches, overturned logs and stream crossings, calling the names Hannah and Ethan every few minutes. No one answered. The only reply was the sound of rain on leaves and the river somewhere below. By the fourth day, fatigue and frustration crept in. Volunteers from nearby towns began heading home, needing to return to their jobs and families. Only the core search teams remained, sheriff's deputies and federal rangers who rotated shifts around the clock. Their pace slowed as morale dropped. Every evening they gathered around camp lanterns, comparing GPS coordinates and sketching possible paths the couple might have taken if they'd left the campsite on foot. Every line circled back to the same problem. No exit tracks, no new entries, nothing that made sense. Burke tried to keep the team grounded. "We treat it like a rescue until we have proof it's not," he said during one briefing. "That means keep looking, keep listening, and don't assume the worst." But off the record, most of them already had. Cases that start with an empty camp rarely end well. The only question was whether nature or something else had taken them. On September 14th, Linda joined a small unit on a patrol near Creek Bend. Though untrained, she insisted on being part of the effort. A ranger walking beside her later recalled that she carried her daughter's picture in a Ziploc bag, showing it to anyone they passed. "She wouldn't let go of hope," he said. "It was the kind of determination you could feel, even in the rain." That afternoon, weather took another turn. Winds reached 20 miles per hour, pushing through the narrow canyons. Communication between the three teams began breaking apart entirely. Static filled the radios, and for nearly an hour no one could reach the unit on Devil's Spine. When they finally checked in, they reported no finds, just exhaustion and low supplies. By evening, Burke called the teams back to base. He looked over the map of marked territories. Every inch of color represented hours of work. None of it brought them closer to an answer. The forest had given nothing. No fabric caught on a branch, no scrap of equipment washed downstream, no new footprints along the banks. It was as if the two campers had been swallowed whole by the landscape. That same night, the Bitterroot Chronicle, a small-town newspaper, published the story under the headline, "Two Campers Vanish Without a Trace, the Silver Ridge Mystery." The headline stuck. Within days, other papers and local radio stations began using the same phrase. Residents from nearby towns drove up to watch the search from the road, whispering about accidents, wild animals, or something worse. Burke hated the attention but couldn't deny the name fit. "It's not a mystery because we don't know where they are," he told a reporter. "It's a mystery because there's nothing to work with." In a brief press conference, he summarized the facts plainly. "We have no leads, no signs of foul play, and no direction to follow." The forest just swallowed them. The quote would be printed in paper. The pause didn't mean surrender, but it felt close. As the searchers packed their gear and checked off assignments, silence fell over the base camp. Everyone knew they were leaving without closure. Some leaned against their trucks, staring at the dark line of trees as if expecting Hannah or Ethan to step out any second. By nightfall, the first phase of the Silver Ridge search was officially suspended. Nearly a week of relentless effort had produced no answers. No signs of struggle, no evidence of wildlife attack, no proof of any direction taken. For the families waiting at home, that silence was worse than bad news. For the sheriff, it meant facing a report that read exactly the same as the first one. Missing. Location unknown. Cause undetermined. The first week closed not with discovery, but with a vacuum. A sense that something about this forest didn't just hide people. It erased them. And as the teams drove out of Silver Ridge that night, the rain began again, falling over the same mountains that had swallowed 2 names and left only questions behind. By the last week of September 1981, Montana had already turned white. Snow began to fall across the upper ridges of Silver Ridge National Forest. Too early, too heavy, and too cold for a search team that had been out for 3 straight weeks. Helicopters could no longer fly safely. Radios froze, boots tore, and every trail that had once been open was now buried beneath ice and slush. The official search ended on September 29th. After nearly 21 days, no bodies, no clothing, no equipment, not even a broken tent pole had been found. Sheriff Raymond Burke gathered his officers in the ranger station and dictated his closing statement. Based on the terrain, the journal entry about the creek, and the rainfall recorded that week, he concluded that Hannah Cole and Ethan Price most likely died in an accident, either swept away by flash flooding or lost to a fall in one of the ravines. The case, he said, would remain open, but inactive, pending new evidence. It was the kind of ending small-town sheriffs have to give when nature wins. But not everyone accepted it. For Linda Cole, Hannah's mother, the report read like an insult. There were no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks, no torn gear, just absence. She couldn't understand how 2 adults, careful and experienced, could vanish completely without leaving behind even one trace of their campsite. If they'd fallen or drowned, she told a reporter, something would have surfaced. Something always does. When the official crews left Silver Ridge, Linda stayed behind. She rented a small cabin 20 miles away in the town of Darby and started building her own team. Within 2 weeks, she had gathered 5 men, 3 Vietnam veterans who volunteered after seeing her on the local news, 2 mountain guides from Missoula who knew the Bitterroot wilderness, and a retired survival instructor who agreed to help map the search routes. Together, they became an unofficial rescue unit with one goal: to find Hannah and Ethan. Linda designed flyers herself. They read, "Missing, Hannah Cole 22 and Ethan Price 24, Silver Ridge, Montana, September. 1,981, $5,000 reward for verified information." She drove across the state, tacking them up at truck stops, gas stations, grocery stores, and post offices. Within a month, nearly every town between Helena and Spokane had one of her posters pinned to a wall. Her small group spent weekends combing through the same areas police had already searched: Creek Bend, North Trail, Devil's Spine. They used the same tools available to rescue teams at the time: metal detectors, ropes, flashlights, and paper maps. They checked under boulders, along riverbanks, and inside abandoned mines. The snow thickened, the cold deepened, and still nothing surfaced. Winter forced them out by December, but when the thaw came the next spring, Linda returned. Her resolve hadn't faded. If anything, it had hardened. "If the forest took them," she said, "then the forest can give them back." By the summer of 1982, her private search had become a statewide story. Regional TV shows like America's Missing and Good Morning Northwest interviewed her at the base of Silver Ridge. Cameras followed as she unfolded maps, marked coordinates, and pointed out where she believed her daughter's tent might have stood. One journalist described her as the mother who never left the mountain. To the public, she was a symbol of faith in the face of indifference. To Sheriff Burke, who was still receiving daily calls from reporters, she was a reminder that closure was far from over. Letters began arriving at Linda's mailbox by the hundreds. Some offered prayers. Others claimed sightings. A gas station clerk in Idaho swore he'd seen a woman matching Hannah's description hitchhiking west. A truck driver from Oregon sent a letter saying he'd picked up a young couple with camping gear months earlier. None of the tips held up. Every lead evaporated. The Ethan Price family, meanwhile, had gone quiet. They believed the official report and wanted to move on. The Price family publicly stated they did not support further private searches, calling them an unnecessary reopening of grief. That statement made headlines in the Missoulian and deepened the rift between the two families. He said Linda didn't respond publicly, but in her personal journal, she wrote, "They gave up on him. I won't give up on her." Throughout 1982, she returned to Silver Ridge again and again, usually alone. Locals would see her Jeep parked near the trailhead, always the same vehicle, always the same spot. She'd spend days hiking along the creeks, taking photos, writing notes, measuring changes in the terrain. Some rangers began to help quietly, marking areas she'd already searched so others wouldn't disturb them. One young ranger later said, "She knew that forest better than most of us who worked there." As the year drew to a close, the sheriff's department, under growing budget pressure, officially closed the case. The paperwork listed the status as unresolved disappearance, no further evidence available. To the state, it was over. To Linda, it was just frozen in time. During that final winter, she rented a cabin near Creek Bend and stayed through Christmas. Locals remembered seeing a small campfire at dusk, smoke rising through the snow. When asked later why she stayed, she said she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter being left alone in the dark. Her personal notes from that period were later found neatly stacked in a box labeled Silver Ridge, 1981 to 1982. One entry read, "The water moves differently every year. It carries pieces of the past. If I keep coming back, one day it might return them." By early 1983, most of Montana had stopped talking about the Silver Ridge case. New disappearances, new crimes, and new storms had taken the headlines. The forest had reclaimed its silence. But Linda Cole refused to let her daughter's story be forgotten. She became a fixture in the area, known by hikers and rangers as the woman who never gave up. Even as years passed, she returned every summer, sometimes with volunteers, sometimes alone. She redrew maps, tracked rainfall records, and noted small shifts in riverbanks after spring floods. Her obsession wasn't reckless. It was organized, methodical, almost scientific. She was teaching herself how to think like an investigator because no one else was still looking. Some locals admired her. Others called her delusional. A store owner in Darby recalled, "She came in every season, bought supplies, and left a note on our board that said, 'If you find anything unusual, call me.' 15 years would pass before new technology and a new detective reopened the file. But for Linda, those years weren't wasted. They were her life's mission. She believed that answers existed somewhere beneath the cold rivers and rocks of Silver Ridge. By the end of 1982, the case file was buried in an archive box at the county office, labeled and forgotten. Yet across the state, in a small wooden cabin surrounded by pine and silence, a single woman kept the story alive. Her persistence transformed what could have been a forgotten tragedy into something larger, a symbol of endurance. In the heart of Montana, where the mountains rarely give back what they take, Linda Cole continued to search, year after year, in the same place her daughter had disappeared. When a ranger asked her once why she wouldn't let it go, she answered simply, "Because the mountain still owes me 2 names." It would take more than a decade, a new generation of investigators, and the rise of forensic mapping technology before that debt began to be repaid. But in 1982, standing alone beside Creek Bend with snow melting at her feet, Linda Cole was still waiting for the forest to speak. 14 years after the campsite went silent, the case file came back to life. In 1995, the Montana Department of Justice launched the Cold Trails Initiative, a push to re-examine cold cases with newer tools and fresh eyes. The disappearance at Silver Ridge landed on the desk of Michael Grant, 38, a state investigator who'd started his career on evidence vans and never lost the habit of reading small details before big theories. Grant began the way good reopenings begin, by rebuilding the record. The original reports from 1981 were brittle and faded. Some photos had bled at the edges, a few maps were missing. He scanned everything that remained. Sheriff Burke's scene notes, ranger logs, permit stubs, the early search grids, and a handful of black and white prints from the campsite. He also requested access to Hannah Cole's journals, which her mother Linda had kept sealed in a plastic bin for years. Linda shipped them overnight with a short note. "If this helps you hear what the forest wouldn't say, use everything." The journals mattered. Hannah's entries were short, disciplined, and practical. Wind shifts, ground firmness, water noise, animal sign. One line, dated September 8, 1981, had already circulated in the original file, but seeing it in her handwriting gave it weight. "The water sounded closer last night. Maybe the creek's changed its path." Grant circled it in red. A sentence like that isn't fear, it's a field observation. It creates a timeline. The night before they vanished, something about the creek changed. From the start, Grant set a tone of measured expectations. There would be no wild theories, no dramatic reenactments, no promises to solve it in a month. He met with Sheriff Burke, who had retired but agreed to walk him through the old search decisions. Burke didn't dramatize what they did or make excuses for what they couldn't. He repeated the same line he'd used in a press briefing back then. "We had no leads, no signs of foul play, and no direction to follow." He added a quieter sentence, meant only for the new investigator. "If you can give that family a line, just one line that points somewhere, I'll sleep better." Grant also requested help from Dr. Laura Peterson, a hydrogeologist at the University of Montana who studied mountain watersheds. He didn't ask her to solve the case. He asked a narrower question. Could the creek near Silver Ridge have shifted rapidly in 1981? Dr. Peterson pulled climate records and rainfall logs from that week. The data showed a major rain event on September 9th, one of the highest single-day totals in the region in 2 decades. That didn't prove anything on its own, but it supported Hannah's note and reframed the context. The night before the couple went missing, the environment around their campsite may have changed in a way that mattered. Next came organization, not overreach. Grant digitized the paper maps and layered them with updated topography, early geographic information system work that let him compare the estimated creek layout from 1981 to the current channel. He wasn't trying to build a courtroom exhibit. He just wanted to know where water might have wandered. The overlay suggested that Silver Ridge Creek had shifted course at least twice since the early 1980s. That was enough to justify a controlled look at specific points along the banks. Grant called Linda and explained the plan in plain language. He would lead a limited field survey near the original campsite and along the lower bends. Not a massive search, and not a media event. "We'll keep it tight and respectful," he said. Linda agreed. She had spent years on those same bends with a notebook and a compass. Now she'd watch professionals try again. "Thank you for not promising the impossible," she told him. The survey team was small. 2 investigators, a seasoned ranger, a field tech comfortable with early GPS units, and a consulting geologist. They carried camera cables, measuring tapes, and basic sampling kits. The goal wasn't to dig up the forest. It was to walk smart lines, observe edges, and bank anything that looked like it didn't belong. They started near Creek Bend, where pencil marks on Ethan's map had doubled back again and again. The ground there felt modest underfoot, packed soil, smooth stones, a steady channel that spoke in constant sound. A calm surface can hide momentum. The team treated it with respect. Over 3 days they worked in short sweeps, breaking the area into manageable corridors. The ranger called out debris clusters by type: wood, leaf, plastic. Most of it was ordinary runoff. A bottle cap older than the case, a rusted lure tangled in root, a length of fishing line sun-damaged and brittle. Then, near a shallow split in the bank, the field tech paused. Half buried in silt and gravel lay a thin strip of fabric, sun-bleached but still holding color. He pried it loose with gloved fingers. Nylon. Pale blue-green, the strip was no smoking gun. It was small, no more than a few inches wide, and rough along one torn edge. But it had a distinct weave and a faint chemical smell common to coated outdoor fabric from that era. The team sealed it in a sterile bag and logged coordinates. No announcements, no speculation. Grant radioed a short update back to base. 1 possible textile fragment found near Lower Bend. Submitting to lab. He didn't overstate it. He didn't need to. After 14 years of silence, a single physical object mattered. Back in Helena, the state crime lab performed a straightforward material analysis. It wasn't dramatic science. It was process 101. Microscopy to read the weave, elemental analysis to understand the coating, and a check for embedded particulates that could point to where the fabric had traveled. While the lab did its work, Grant traced retail records from 1981 that still existed for outdoor gear. Hannah had purchased a North Peak Expedition tent that summer. The manufacturer's catalog from that year described a specific nylon weight and finish. The lab couldn't certify a perfect match off a fragment, but it could say whether the fabric belonged to the same class. While waiting, Grant met Linda in a coffee shop 2 towns from Silver Ridge. He kept the conversation grounded, no timelines, no guarantees. He told her about the fragment in careful terms. "It's something we can test," he said. "That's what I can say today." Linda listened, hands wrapped around a paper cup. She had sat through many false starts. She appreciated the restraint. "I don't need a promise," she replied. "I need a path." The reopened case had a rhythm that made sense to everyone involved. Collect, confirm, and only then conclude. There were no TV crews walking the banks, no press conferences at the trailhead. The work stayed small because the facts were small. That doesn't mean the stakes were small. For the first time since 1981, the file contained new data points. A climate record consistent with Hannah's observation, a map overlay that showed channel drift, and a textile fragment taken from a logical corridor below the campsite. Grant's notes from that month read like a checklist. Digitized archive complete. Rainfall corroborated. Creek drift supported. Field survey executed. Textile fragment recovered. Lab pending. It wasn't a story yet. It was structure. The thing Sheriff Burke had hoped for when he said he wanted a single line that pointed somewhere. In a short call, Burke told Grant, "If that's tent fabric, the creek isn't just scenery. It's an actor." The emotional center of this phase didn't come from speeches or breakthroughs. It came from the quiet alignment of facts old and new. Hannah's sentence about the water, the early snow that had shut down the first search, the absence of footprints and the missing tent fabric in 1981, the retraced maps, the rain event. A small, stubborn fragment freed from silt 14 years later. Each piece on its own said little. Together, they pulled the case gently in one direction, toward the creek. Grant kept the focus narrow by design. He didn't try to reconstruct every hour of September 9th and 10th. He didn't speculate about arguments, visitors, or a dozen faint possibilities that had fueled rumor for years. He made a choice rare in cold case work and respected by the team. Follow only what the evidence can carry. If the water had moved, the next rational question was where it could have carried light gear, fabric, small metal, coated nylon, and where that gear might still be recoverable after more than a decade of seasons. The lab results would take time, and Grant accepted that. Meanwhile, he organized the file so a reader could understand it in clean chronological steps. 1. Campsite discovery. 2. Original search limitations. 3. Journal entry noting a water change. 4. Historical rainfall confirming unusual flow. 5. Modern mapping showing channel shifts. 6. Targeted survey. 7. Textile fragment recovered and submitted. There was room for outcomes to change, but there was no room left for the idea that nothing could be done. Something had been done, and the case had moved. Linda sensed that shift. She didn't celebrate. She paced herself. After years of working alone on the banks of Silver Ridge Creek, she finally had language that matched what she'd felt every time she stood over its edge. The creek doesn't always stay where you leave it. "If the water is the key," she told Grant, "thank you for turning it." On May 14, 1996, the search team returned to the mountains with a tighter plan and modest expectations. Michael Grant had expanded the search grid using basic GIS overlays, pushing the perimeter 5.8 miles southeast of the old campsite toward a thin, dark cut in the landscape locals called Raven's Gorge. The place hardly appeared on current maps. It was a narrow channel, about 90 feet deep in the steepest section, walled with damp stone and scrub. You didn't hike into Raven's Gorge by accident. You had to mean it. The team moved in slow and deliberate passes. A veteran ranger led on foot, marking safe ledges and stable rock. A field tech followed with a cable camera and a compact ground-penetrating unit, tools that hadn't existed when the case first went cold. Their objective was simple: read the edges, test the pockets, and pull anything that didn't belong to the canyon. No heroics, no guesswork. By mid-morning, the cable camera caught something that wasn't rock, root, or leaf. The monitor showed a pale edge lodged beneath silt near the north wall, about 20 feet above the current water line. It could have been nothing: a wrapper, a scrap of tarp, old fishing gear. The tech eased the line back, and the ranger climbed down to the ledge, bracing against a wet seam in the stone. With a gloved hand and a small trowel, he loosened the top layer of silt and lifted out a thin strip of fabric, bleached by seasons, but still holding a faint blue-green. It flexed like nylon. Grant didn't celebrate. He logged it, bagged it, and called out the coordinates. Nearby, the same ledge gave up a twisted length of lightweight aluminum, the kind used in pole sections, and a clouded white plastic sleeve that looked like a pole connector. All three items were photographed in place, measured and sealed. The scene told a consistent story. Equipment once under tension had been torqued and torn, not cut, not burned, not chewed. The ranger, still catching his breath, said the line they all felt but wouldn't write down. This stuff didn't come apart gently. Back at the staging table, the fabric showed a faded serial code along one hem, most digits gone, 4 still readable. Those 4 matched a production batch listed in the 1981 catalog for the North Peak Expedition line, the same model Hannah Cole had purchased in Seattle, according to a receipt her mother had preserved. That didn't prove ownership. It did narrow the field from thousands of tents to a brand, a model year, and a batch. The canyon gave one more detail before the team pulled back for the day. Under the lip of a rock in a small eddy of pebbles and fine sand, the cable camera caught a film of iron-stained grit worked into the weave of the nylon. In places like Raven's Gorge, water doesn't just carry objects. It presses the canyon into them. The grit was bagged for lab work, the same as the fabric and hardware. Grant followed procedure to the letter. He routed the evidence to Helena Crime Lab with a clear request. Identify material class, read the weave, test chemical coatings, and characterize the embedded particulates. He asked them to answer narrow questions, not big ones. Is this nylon consistent with early 80s expedition tents? Is the coating consistent with waterproofing used in that era? Do the minerals in the grit match the canyon's known sediment profile? Nothing more. The preliminary report came back with straightforward language. Under a standard scope, the nylon's thread count and weave pattern aligned with high denier-coated tent fabric used in the early 1980s. Under higher magnification, the tear edges were stretched and feathered, the signature of hydraulic force, not a blade. The aluminum showed torsional stress consistent with rapid bending and collapse, not clean breaks. The particulates included fine quartz, iron oxides, and clay fractions that matched samples taken from Raven's Gorge. There were no traces of hydrocarbons, no combustion residue, no biological staining. In plain terms, the water did the damage, and it did it here. Grant gathered the team in a small conference room and kept the message tight. No one walks away from water like that, he said. If they were in the gorge when it surged, they never had a chance. It wasn't dramatic. It was the cleanest interpretation of what the evidence allowed. The room was quiet. After 15 years, the case finally had physical alignment between a location, a mechanism, and the kind of equipment the couple carried. Word traveled fast, even though no one tried to make a spectacle of it. Local stations framed it as the Raven's Gorge discovery. Reporters called it the first real clue since 1981. The phrase stuck because it was accurate. It wasn't closure, but it was a measurable turn. Linda Cole got the call from Grant himself. He didn't hedge, but he didn't oversell it either. He explained the find, the lab's preliminary read, and what it suggested about the force of water in the canyon. Linda flew to Montana and met him in a modest evidence room, the kind with metal shelves and sharp, fluorescent light. They set the bagged fragment on the table. She didn't ask for reassurances. She pressed a hand on the plastic and said, almost to herself, "At least now I know they weren't abandoned by time." The mountain finally spoke. It was not relief. It was contact with something real. Public interest spiked again, this time with a different tone. Instead of theories about intruders or hidden, Grant kept the scope limited. He authorized a broadened survey within Raven's Gorge and down into the lower reaches near Creek Bend, but with the same careful rules. Observe, record, retrieve. No speculative digs, no deep excavations. The point was not to strip the canyon. It was to understand the path of water on the night that mattered, and collect trace evidence strong enough to stand on its own. He documented the plan in plain language, the way he wrote everything in this case. No flourishes, just tasks and reasons. What made the moment powerful wasn't just what the team found. It was what they didn't find. No signs of accelerants, no tool marks, no fibers or residues that read like human interference. The absence of those signals didn't prove a negative, but coupled with the positive evidence of hydraulic tearing and local sediment, it tightened the picture. The canyon wasn't a crime scene. It was a force line. For the community that had lived with rumors for a decade and a half, that distinction mattered. People in Montana understand that wilderness can end a life without leaving a signpost. Still, this case had lingered because it left nothing at all. No trail, no trace, no reason. The fabric and the poles gave them the first honest reason that fit the map, the weather, and the tidy campsite left behind. The tent stakes still in the ground, the missing fabric, the neat kitchen and the shoes by the door, those details, baffling in 1981, made sense beside the mechanics of a black water surge in a narrow cut of stone. Grant's notes from the day of the discovery were brief. Coordinates, elevation, angle of the ledge, depth of silt. Items recovered. Chain of custody. He didn't write about relief or vindication. He wrote down what happened and where. That discipline had defined the reopening from the start, and it kept the case from drifting back into speculation now. The national shows picked up the story with respectful restraint. Segments aired on America's Missing and a regional Dateline hour, summarizing the find and quoting the lab's phrasing. Tearing consistent with high-velocity water flow. The attention helped only in one practical way. It brought in a handful of volunteers with technical skills the team could use for short windows. A surveyor who could help refine elevation profiles, a retired hydrology tech who understood back-eddy deposition, a climber with rigging expertise for safer access to the canyon's side pockets. Grant accepted assistance where it fit the plan and declined what didn't. Through it all, Linda stayed close but not intrusive. She visited the staging site once, left coffee for the crew, and returned to a motel in town. In the evening, she drove the old forest roads she'd driven 100 times before, stopping at pullouts where the trees opened just enough to see a line of rock and green. She had lived with nothing for years. Now she had something, and she treated it with the quiet attention it deserved. By the end of that week, the file on Raven's Gorge no longer consisted of rumors and a name on a map. It held coordinates, photographs, lab language, and a small collection of weathered hardware that fit one story better than any other. Violent water moving through a narrow channel on a night when rain was recorded at historic levels. There was more work to do, more places to check along the flow path, more edges to test, but the tone had changed. The investigation had shifted from whether the canyon mattered to how it had mattered. The day closed without ceremony. Grant signed the lab request forms for extended analysis and updated the case summary to reflect the new physical evidence. The team packed their ropes and sensors and hiked out in fading light. The gorge kept its echo, but it no longer kept its silence. For the first time since Daniel Reed found a warm coffee pot and 4 quiet tent stakes in 1981, there was a clear line from the campsite to a place on the map where the environment itself could explain what followed. That line was hard-won, small on paper, and heavy in meaning. It didn't finish the story. It finally gave it traction. By the spring of 1996, the search that had once been about memory had turned into one built entirely on data. After the discovery at Raven's Gorge, investigator Michael Grant and Dr. Laura Peterson, a hydrologist from the University of Montana, set out to rebuild the night that had taken 2 lives and left 15 years of silence behind. They began with weather archives, geological maps, and handwritten field reports. Everything was converted into the early HydroMap 2.1 system, primitive by today's standards, but advanced enough to translate rainfall, slope, and soil density into a working picture of what had happened on the night of September 9, 1981. The model ran on numbers that didn't lie. At 2:15 a.m., Silver Ridge Creek had spiked from a calm 3-foot flow to over 9 feet of surge in less than 40 minutes. The inputs showed what the first responders in 1981 could only guess. The mountains had taken the storm straight on. Dr. Peterson's analysis confirmed a short-lived but violent redirection of the creek. Instead of running along its usual westward path, the water had burst through a narrow cut in the ridge, the same cut that formed Raven's Gorge. That shift turned a trickle into a confined channel, where the walls compressed the surge and multiplied its force. Peterson put it simply: a perfect corridor for disaster. At its peak, the simulation showed current speeds between 25 and 30 miles per hour, mixed with gravel, timber, and debris from the slope. That combination, high velocity and heavy sediment, created what's known as a blackwater event, a wave that moves like concrete. It doesn't just sweep objects away, it grinds them down as it goes. When the numbers stabilized, the result was impossible to ignore. The coordinates of maximum flow pressure matched almost exactly with the spot where Grant's team had recovered the torn North Peak Expedition tent fabric the year before. The conclusion formed itself. Hannah and Ethan had likely been awake when it began, startled by the rising sound of water outside their tent. They may have tried to climb to higher ground, following a faint path toward the ridge, unaware that the creek had already broken its banks behind them. In the dark, without light or footing, they would have reached the mouth of Raven's Gorge, just as the redirected surge struck. Peterson's report noted that a 30-mile-an-hour current in that canyon would have been unsurvivable for even trained climbers. There would have been no time to react, no warning beyond the roar. As the hydrology team finalized their findings, Grant's field unit went back into the terrain with that new data in hand. Using GPS coordinates derived from the model, they began checking downstream pockets where lighter debris might have settled once the flow slowed. On the 3rd day near Creek Bend, they found 3 items: a broken aluminum tent pole, a pair of wool socks hardened by years of mud, and a fragment of synthetic blanket wedged between roots along the bank. Each was photographed, logged, and sent to the state lab in Helena. The soil samples taken from those items matched perfectly with the mineral profile from Raven's Gorge. Wet sandstone and clay with traces of iron oxide, unique to the gorge and its immediate runoff basin. The match was so precise that the lab technician wrote in his report, "Same source, same storm." For Grant, the evidence had finally lined up in a way that made sense, physically, geographically, and logically. There was no sign of criminal interference, no human pattern at all. Only the math of water, slope, and time. When he compiled the new summary for the Montana Bureau of Investigation, it spanned 48 pages, a mix of lab reports, hydrology charts, and field maps. The conclusion read plainly: accidental death due to flash flood. Bodies unconfirmed due to terrain loss and sediment movement. It was the first cold case in the state to be solved through environmental forensics alone, without witnesses, confessions, or physical remains. News of the findings spread quickly. Local radio stations ran short updates. "Silver Ridge Mystery solved by science." Regional papers called it "a flood remembered." When the Bureau held a press conference in Missoula, Linda Cole sat in the front row. She'd waited 15 years for an answer. Grant walked her through the model, where the creek turned, where the tent likely stood, where the water swallowed the ground. When a reporter asked if she believed the conclusion, she didn't hesitate. "I do," she said, "because I always knew the answer would be found in the earth, not in people." The room went silent. To her, the truth didn't bring relief, but it ended the doubt. It was no longer a mystery built on absence. It was a story with cause and consequence. Grant later wrote that she was the spirit that refused to give up on silence. Without her maps, her notes, and her persistence, there would have been nothing to reopen, nothing to model, and nothing to prove. In the weeks that followed, the community at Silver Ridge organized a small memorial near the site of the original campsite. Locals brought flowers, a few left photos, and someone carved a message into a cedar plank. The mountain took them, but truth brought them home. The plaque stood under the same trees where Daniel Reed had first found the untouched coffee pot and the empty chairs 15 years earlier. Grant attended quietly, standing in the back beside a ranger from the original search. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. What had once been a haunting legend in the Bitterroot Range was now something grounded, tragic, but understood. Later, at his desk, Grant finalized his last entry for the Silver Ridge file. Case closed. Cause of disappearance consistent with documented flash flood on September 9, 1981. Investigation complete. He paused before typing one final note at the bottom, a line not for the record, but for himself. Some mysteries aren't solved by who, but by how. That night, as he shut down the monitor, the final frame of the hydrology model lingered on the screen. Digital blue lines snaking across a 3D map of the ridge. The simulated flood pulsed through Raven's Gorge exactly where the evidence had been found. It was simple science, but it carried weight. It showed the violence of the storm, the narrow chance of survival, and the path that explained everything people had guessed at for years. The case had begun with a warm coffee pot on a cold morning, a scene that once seemed impossible to explain. 15 years later, it ended with a model that could. The truth wasn't comforting, but it was real. And for the first time since 1981, the Silver Ridge mystery had an answer. drawn not from rumor or speculation, but from the earth itself. By the spring of 1997, nearly a year after the flood reconstruction report had closed the scientific case, Silver Ridge gave up something it had kept hidden for 16 years. 3 amateur hikers from Bozeman were following the lower bend of Silver Ridge Creek when they noticed a torn piece of fabric wedged between rocks near a shallow runoff. What they thought was trash turned out to be the remains of a sleeping bag, its fabric brittle, discolored, but still patterned with the distinctive stitching of a North Peak expedition model. The same brand Hannah Cole had purchased in Seattle before her trip. A few feet away, half buried in silt, they found a rusted tin can with faint etchings at the bottom. Under the dirt, the letters were still visible. E. Price. It was the kind of personalized marking campers used to carve with pocket knives back in the early 80s. The hikers photographed the find, then contacted the Bitterroot County Sheriff's Office, which sealed off the area within hours. The items were carefully packed and sent to the Helena Crime Lab for testing. For the first time in years, the Silver Ridge file had new evidence. The lab confirmed the fabric came from a nylon-cotton blend used exclusively in the 1981 North Peak Expedition series. Chemical analysis showed the same polymer structure as the material from the tent fragment found at Raven's Gorge the previous year. The sediment lodged in the fibers matched the sandstone and clay mix unique to the Raven's Gorge Creek Bend Basin, the same area identified in the hydrological models. On the tin can, beneath corrosion layers, technicians found mechanical etching marks consistent with hand carving rather than factory production. One technician noted in his report, surface oxidation consistent with over a decade of exposure in moist sediment. When the lab used enhanced imaging to reveal the full inscription, another faint marking appeared, E+H. The same pairing had been seen on a silver ring worn by Ethan Price in photographs from the summer of 1981. A week later, during a follow-up search near the same creek bed, deputies discovered a small silver ring lodged under a root along the waterline. Inside the band were 4 tiny letters, E+H minus summer 81. It matched the design and engraving in family photos. Together, the sleeping bag, the can, and the ring formed the first complete physical link between the missing couple and the area where the flood models had predicted the water carried debris that night. By October 1997, investigator Michael Grant finalized the closing report. It was signed and filed under the title, Silver Ridge Vanishing, Case Closed. The conclusion read simply, Probable accidental death due to flash flood event, September 9, 1981. No evidence of criminal activity. Case resolved through geological and environmental correlation. In the press conference held in Helena, Grant spoke quietly but with certainty. We couldn't bring them home, he said, but we brought the truth back. The case that had once haunted a generation of searchers had finally been given an ending grounded in fact, not rumor, not theory, but proof. Linda Cole, now 61, stood near the front during the announcement. On the table beside the podium sat a small glass case containing the ring, the sleeping bag fabric, and the rusted can. Later that year, the recovered evidence was displayed at the Montana Missing Persons exhibit in Missoula. The display case bore a small plaque, the Silver Ridge Case, 1981 to 1997. Inside, the tent fabric, sleeping bag, and ring were placed side by side. A brief description read, recovered following a 15-year investigation. An example of truth without recovery. Linda kept one small piece of the tent, the first fragment ever found at Raven's Gorge. She had it framed and hung by the kitchen window in her Seattle home. When a journalist asked why, she said, "I look at it every morning. It reminds me that silence doesn't mean nothing happened." When the episode aired nationwide on Cold Cases Revisited in late 1998, the headline read, "The Vanishing Campers, Solved by Science." The program detailed how modern mapping, rainfall data, and environmental forensics had finally unraveled a mystery long thought unsolvable. Newspapers across the country ran with the story, calling it "Science Meets Heartbreak." For viewers, it wasn't just a cold case solved. It was proof that patience, evidence, and persistence could bring clarity, even after decades. The story of Silver Ridge became required reading in investigative training sessions for environmental forensics across several states. 2 years later, in 1999, the community of Silver Ridge held a small ceremony at Creek Bend, the site of Hannah and Ethan's final campsite. Locals carved a wooden plaque and mounted it on a cedar post overlooking the water. The inscription read, "In memory of Hannah and Ethan, lost but found in spirit." Among those attending were Michael Grant, several original search team members, and townspeople who had volunteered in 1981. The gathering was small. No cameras, no speeches. Just a few words, a prayer, and the sound of water moving gently through the new flood warning system installed after the investigation. That system, an automated rain gauge and creek monitor, had been proposed by Dr. Laura Peterson and funded in part by a donation from the Cole family, ensuring that future campers would have early warning of rising water. By the end of that year, the Silver Ridge vanishing was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was a closed chapter in Montana's history. No one had been rescued, no bodies recovered. But there was truth, and that, for Linda Cole, was enough. When she spoke to the Bitterroot Chronicle for a final interview, she said, "Not everyone who's lost can be found, but every soul deserves to be remembered." Her words resonated far beyond Montana. Other families of the missing began reaching out, seeking guidance on reopening old cases with new technology. Linda's persistence inspired what became the Silver Ridge Foundation, created to help search teams and families apply scientific tools to long-cold disappearances. 16 years after the morning a ranger found a still warm coffee pot and 2 empty chairs, the story had come full circle. The mountains hadn't given back the people, but they had given back the truth. And in the quiet flow of Silver Ridge Creek, with a wooden sign watching over it, that truth would never be forgotten. By late 1998, nearly 2 years after the case had closed, the story of the vanishing campers of Silver Ridge had become more than an investigation. It was a landmark in how America understood cold cases. It proved that time and technology could still bring clarity, even when recovery was impossible. The Montana Bureau of Investigation published a report titled "Resolution Through Evidence," citing Silver Ridge as the first case in state history to reach closure without recovered bodies. The techniques used, GIS mapping, hydrological modeling, and terrain correlation, became the foundation for a new investigative discipline, environmental forensics. Universities across the country began teaching the case as a model of patience and precision, where data and human determination worked hand in hand. For locals, though, it wasn't about science. It was about Hannah and Ethan, and Linda Cole, who never stopped searching. Every September, at the annual Remembrance for Montana's Missing, her words were repeated aloud. Not everyone who's lost can be found, but every soul deserves to be remembered. The wooden sign at Creek Bend turned into a quiet pilgrimage site. Visitors still leave wildflowers, white stones, and scraps of paper that say simply, "We remember." After the investigation ended, Linda founded the Silver Ridge Foundation, a small nonprofit that helps families of the missing get access to search technology and flood data. She refused every offer to turn the story into a movie. "This isn't entertainment," she said. "It's remembrance." When she passed away in 2010, her headstone carried only one line: Mother of Silver Ridge. Michael Grant, the investigator who reopened the case, left the bureau soon after. He began teaching full-time at the University of Montana, leading a course called Forensics in the Wilderness. Each semester he told his students that truth doesn't always bring peace, but it always brings understanding. He kept in touch with the old search team, who went on to pioneer modern forensic mapping for cold cases nationwide. The story reached a broader audience through shows like Cold Cases Revisited and The American Missing Files. Journalists called it resolution without recovery, a story without villains or confessions, but with proof, persistence, and closure. Writers and filmmakers borrowed from it for decades, seeing in it the tension between science and sorrow, between what's explainable and what never quite leaves you. Today, the wooden memorial still stands near Creek Bend. The stream runs a little quieter now, but each fall, the rain returns and the water brushes against the old cedar plaque. The carved words are fading, but still readable. They came to explore the wild and became part of it forever. The Silver Ridge vanishing remains one of those rare cases where nature took two lives, but gave back a truth strong enough to outlast the years. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories of persistence,